Hello, welcome back. I'm Gray McBride, and I am a licensed professional counselor associate, and this is the second of a series of videos where I discuss some takeaways that I have had from reading Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation. Last time we briefly went over the pre-device world and how it was full of everything that children and adolescents specifically need in order to grow and thrive as human beings. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the changes that were brought on by devices specifically. So one thing that is really important to kind of delineate is that sometimes there is this pushback when problems or challenges are raised about devices and their impact specifically on teenagers and children. And the argument usually goes something like, children have been watching TV for generations and it hasn't seemed to make that much of a difference, which is actually true. The research shows that teenagers in the 1990s were watching a little bit less than 3 hours of television a day. So yes, devices have been around for a long time. However, what is different is that students, children, teenagers are spending an immense amount of time in comparison on devices and social media now. The average preteen spends about 40 hours a week on their devices, and the average teenager between the ages of 13 and 18 spend about 50 hours a week on devices. This is the equivalent of a full-time job, and for almost all of these children, this is on top of full-time schooling. It's worth noting too that this does not include any kind of device usage that is happening in their educational setting. Students are getting about 6 to 8 hours per day of leisure time device use, which means that if you compound that with 5 to 6 hours of instructional, educational usage, they are literally almost on their devices all day. And at the very least, that is a huge opportunity cost, which is just the idea that anytime that you spend time doing one thing, you're losing time doing something else. This isn't a massive change from the way that children and teenagers were interacting with devices and with screens prior to the introduction of the smartphone. So another argument that Jonathan Haidt does a really great job, I think, of kind of pushing back on is, how do we know that devices are to blame? There are so many factors that it could be narrowed down to. And so one thing that he kind of looks at is the introduction of the smartphone into the mass market. 2012 is the last year that smartphone users were in the minority in the United States. And conveniently, 2012 is also when we see a sharp uptick in psychiatric emergency visits for young people. It is also the time when time spent with friends among young people began to drop sharply. And in order to kind of push back on this idea that it might just be the US or it might just be something other than devices, Jonathan Haidt looks at trends across 10 different countries, the 5 Anglosphere countries, which are the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And then he looks at the 5 Nordic countries, which is Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And all of the decreased mental health outcomes occurred in the same way and all began around the year 2012, again, when smartphones and smartphone users began to become the majority. Of course, there are so many good things about these devices, so many good things about the technology that we have. And Jonathan Haidt does not make the case, nor am I of the opinion, that devices are all bad. There are certainly positive things that we can do with them and ways that they make our lives better. However, the online world is vastly different than the real world. And humans have evolved in the real world for thousands and thousands of years. So our brains and our bodies are not used to these new devices. And we just need to be aware of how they are affecting us, and especially affecting our children and our teenagers who are undergoing an immense amount of change internally and externally. Some key differences about the online world that Jonathan brings up that I think are really worth noting. Number one, that there is no consensual space online, meaning it is more or less a free-for-all, the wild, wild west of sorts. That, of course, in some cases is amazing and allows for freedom. In other ways, that can be very problematic, especially for children and teenagers who maybe do not have the maturity to know how to navigate those spaces. A second key difference is that everything is available to everyone all the time at little or no cost. This is distinctly different, of course, than the real world where everything is not available to everyone all the time, and almost everything usually comes with a cost. And so, again, there's some democratic, amazing things about the online space where information, for instance, is mostly available to everyone all the time, which is a huge win. However, when all of this stuff is available to everyone, again, especially young people who maybe do not have the cognitive ability to process all of this information and all of the access that they have, it can lead to troublesome outcomes. And finally, because major tech companies have really hesitated to enforce their age restriction policies, everyone online is the same age. And that is problematic, once again, because when everyone is the same age, there is a lack of safeguards for the content that is available to different people. So a 5-year-old can access all of the same information as a 45-year-old. And there are things that 5-year-olds simply should not know about because their brains are not ready to handle it in comparison with a 45-year-old. And the other thing that's concerning about this is that the major tech companies set up their devices with this as the default setting. And I'll get to this in another video, but one of Jonathan Haidt's main recommendations for tech companies is that devices come with restrictions installed so that you have to turn them off, something that would be a lot better, especially for our young people. So in my next video, I am going to cover kind of what the implications of these changes are, specifically for teenagers and for children. I am going to pull a lot of the research that Jonathan Haidt brings out about the differences in how devices and social media impact girls versus boys. There are some really key differences, and it's really important for us to know about those. So to review, devices have changed a lot. Children and teenagers are spending significant amounts of time online and in front of screens. They are interacting with a virtual world that is distinctly different from the real world that they spend the rest of their lives in. And these changes are something that have occurred, as far as the research is concerned, across the Western world. And tying these changes to the introduction of smartphones and device use is something that increasingly is supported by research. Thank you so much for joining me for this video today. I hope that some of the information was helpful. If it was, if you don't mind subscribing, as I am continuing to put out content several times a week that I'm hoping will be helpful to anyone who's interested in learning more about counseling in general, especially those who work with teenagers and children. Other than that, I hope you're having an amazing day, and I'll see you soon.